Hello, welcome, and thanks so much for joining us this evening for a conversation with Ben Rhodes on his book, After the Fall, Being American in the World We've Made. My name is Clancy Disa, and I'm the marketing director of the Seminary Co-op bookstores in Chicago. Our stores were founded in 1961, and in 2019, they became the first not-for-profit bookstores whose mission is bookselling. This mission recognizes bookstores as a fundamental civic institution, and it allows us to work with like-minded partners on events like these. Tonight, we are delighted to be partnering with the University of Chicago's Center for Effective Government, which was founded in 2019 with an ambitious but vital mission to strengthen institutions of democracy and improve government's capacity to solve public problems. Through a robust set of programming and activities, from events to media partnerships, fellowship programs, and scholarly convenings, the center builds bridges between its stakeholders, including scholars, students, practitioners, leaders, journalists, and advocates around three key areas: ideas, education, and engagement. Now let me introduce tonight's presenters. Ben Rhodes is a writer, political commentator, and national security analyst. He is currently a contributor for NBC News and MSNBC, co-host of Pod Save the World, a senior advisor to former President Barack Obama, and chair of National Security Action, which he co-founded with Jake Sullivan in 2018. He is the author of 2 New York Times bestsellers, After the Fall and The World as It Is, a memoir of the Obama White House. His work has also been published in The Atlantic, The Washington Post, The New York Times, and Foreign Affairs. A native New Yorker, Ben has a BA from Rice University and an MFA from New York University. He is joined in conversation by William Howell, the director of the Center for Effective Government, the Sidney Stein Professor in American Politics at the University of Chicago, chair of the Political Science Department, and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He holds additional appointments in the Harris School of Public Policy and the college. William has written widely on separations of powers issues and the American political institutions, especially the presidency. He is also the co-host of the Not Another Politics podcast. His latest book, Presidents, Populism, and the Crisis of Democracy, was written with Stanford professor Terry Moe and was released in July of this year. We are so very happy to have you both with us virtually this evening. And without further ado, I turn it over to Ben Rhodes and William Howell.
Thank you, Clancy. What a joy to be a part of this conversation being hosted by the Seminary Co-op. In my mind, it's the greatest bookstore in the country. And to be in conversation with you, Ben. I really enjoyed reading your book, and I have lots of questions, as I'm sure our audience members do. And I thought to sort of ease into it, you might give us a sense of how it came to be. That is, it's a book that is personal in some ways. You could see in the writing you struggling with some big ideas and trying to make sense of what's happening in this historical moment. It's wide-ranging. And as best I can tell, what happens is that Trump is elected and you set off out into the world to try to make sense of what's happening, not just vis-a-vis Trump, but something larger. Can you just tell us a bit about how the book came into existence and what you're hoping to accomplish with it?
Yeah, and look, thanks for hosting this conversation. It's great to talk to you, someone who's obviously thought so much about these issues, and I got to get out to that bookstore.
It's really great.
I apologize for my background. It's my first day back in an office taping this podcast, and so I grabbed what space I could. But hopefully, my first stop in Chicago will involve both the university and the bookstore. So I'm glad that you took away that this is kind of a multi-dimensional book, and the origin of it kind of explains a lot of how the book turned out, which is, I was flat on my back after the 2016 election. I've been working for 10 straight years for President Obama, from the beginning of his campaign through the very end of his administration. Flew out on his last flight on Air Force One to drop him and Michelle Obama off in California. Came back. Just, I think there's always a disorienting experience leaving a position of, political influence. But when you add to that the fact that you've been succeeded by Donald Trump, who's intent on destroying everything you've worked on, let's just say it was a disorienting time. And, a couple of early trips, I started to travel a lot. I traveled with former President Obama on his overseas travel. I kind of took every opportunity I could to go places. And I realized that there was something interesting about my personal circumstance and something globally. Globally, I knew and I had sensed, throughout the Obama administration, particularly in the later years, that we were dealing with kind of one meta trend in the world in terms of this particular drift towards a kind of nationalist strain of authoritarian politics. You could feel that taking hold everywhere. So I was inherently interested in what was happening in my country, how was it connected to what was happening around the world, and what could I learn about that? And then I had a couple of encounters in those first few months out of the White House. One in Germany, just a couple months after I left. I met with a young woman who becomes a character in the book named Zhana Nemtsova, whose father was Boris Nemtsov. He'd been the leading oppositionist to Putin for many years, and he'd been assassinated in the shadow of the Kremlin. And Zhana came up to see me, and I was with Obama, but I just met alone with Zhana, and she basically told me her story of her father and his assassination, how she'd kind of exiled herself from Russia to look for answers to what happened to him. And it was this incredibly, again, disorienting, use the word again, experience where I met with a lot of people like that when I was in government who wanted me to try to do something. I was powerless to help her. I couldn't offer anything other than advice, really. But she still wanted to tell me this story. And her father's story kind of ends up tracing the arc of Russia's descent from some hope in the 90s that liberal democracy might take root, all the way to his assassination. And it kind of planted a seed in my mind of what it might be like for me to travel and to try to seek out people who kind of lived the things I worked on in the White House from the other end of the perspective of power. People who were activists, oppositionists, dissidents, sometimes in some cases just ordinary young people in a place like Hong Kong, who were on the other end of these trends that I'd experienced from first a position of political influence and then a position of kind of being a political exile in my own country. And I wanted to figure out, frankly, what I would discover about this meta trend in the world and about myself by doing that. And that was the origin point for the book.
So as you point out, your interlocutors consist of dissidents and people who are have either suffered at the hands of rising nationalist autocracy or are pushing back against it. And I want to take some time in a bit to sort of unpack what that work looks like that they're undertaking and the strategies that they deploy. But before doing so, could you sort of lay out for us, I mean, you say that there are these trends happening around the globe. Like, what is the thing that's rising that is that is both common? I mean, part of it is there are these points of connection across Hungary and China and Russia, which are the sort of core areas that you look at. Yeah. And then there's some things that there are differences to be had there too.
Yes.
Like what is it? What is, so unpack this for us a bit.
So a couple of quotes from the book that stand out to me. One is I look at Hungary and I look at Russia and China and I look at America. And I could have unfortunately chosen some other countries too. Mm-hmm. And in Hungary, I was meeting with an activist, and I said to him, well, explain to me how your country went from being basically a democracy to a single party autocracy or soft autocracy in about a decade. And he said, okay, that's simple. Viktor Orban, our prime minister, gets elected on a right-wing populist backlash to the financial crisis in 2008. He then redraws the parliamentary districts to entrench his party in power, changes the voting laws to make it easier for his supporters to vote, packs the court with right-wing judges who will find in his favor, enriches some cronies on the outside who then finances politics. They buy up the media, turn it into a right-wing propaganda machinery, and they wrap the whole thing up in a nationalist us versus them message. Us, the true Hungarians against them, the immigrants, the Muslims, George Soros, liberal elites. And he basically could have been describing my experience with the Republican Party of the United States over the last decade, this experience of people hacking essentially the institutions of democracy for illiberal ends. And the more I pulled on that thread, what I found was essentially Orban in many ways had copied the more extreme version of that playbook that had been pursued by Putin himself in Russia. But the commonalities that I found, I think were illuminated in a very simple way by a Hong Kong official who I talked to, who wanted to be anonymous in Hong Kong. And when I told him I was working to understand this trend of nationalism and authoritarianism in the world, he said, "Oh, this is quite simple." And obviously this is an oversimplification, but it's a useful jumping off point. In the West, the story of the rise of nationalist authoritarianism began with the financial crisis. That's when people lost confidence in the whole project of liberal democracy. And in here, that's when the Chinese Communist Party decided, well, why do we have to wait and defer to the Americans in terms of stewardship of the international financial system, the international political order? It's a drastic oversimplification, but I do think that what he's getting at some point is that there were failures in globalization, in American-led globalization, and America's model of unbridled capitalism, national security, the limitless advance of technology. There are vulnerabilities in that model, both in terms of what it wasn't offering people in terms of a sense of traditional identity, and just in terms of something like the financial crisis that made the whole system appear rigged. And the people who were able to take advantage of that were the people offering the populism of the right, not the left.
Yep.
The oldest story in the book, the ethno-nationalist blood and soil playbook that has been around as long as there's been politics. And that, I think, encompasses what's been going on, not just in the West, but in places like India and Brazil. China is obviously a little different, and I deal with China as an outlier in that they never made any pretense of embracing liberal democracy. But what they do have is the most advanced model of where authoritarianism leads. So it's connected, but I do think the Chinese story is somewhat distinct from the story I tell in other places. What's creepy about it is the way in which those two strands may merge together.
Okay, so boy, you've got a lot in play.
There's a lot there,
So
I know.
There's
Sorry.
a lot there. This is great, though.
Yeah.
I want to try to get clarity about like what's the same and what's different. When it comes to Hungary and Russia, it's a story of kind of emergent, fledgling democracies that then are taken over by an authoritarian who then rolls back democracy in all of its manifestations. But you emphasize in your telling of these two countries slightly different themes. So a thing that you play up more with regards to Hungary is the us versus them politics, that there are true Hungarians. And when you talk about Russia, the theme is a little bit different. You talk, and they're matters of emphasis, I think.
Yeah.
They have to do with corruption and graft and how that figures into both Putin's rise to power and how it presents a certain kind of vulnerability as he tries to hold on to. And this is the sort of at the core of Alexei Navalny's critique. And then in turn, I mean, you have this great bit about Putin that the strategy is not to convince the world that he isn't corrupt. The strategy is to convince his constituents that everybody's corrupt. Yeah. And as long as that is true, then he can hold on to power. But so, which has been by way of saying these are matters of, it's not exactly a common playbook that they're playing from. And at least in your telling, you're emphasizing slightly different kinds of politics and broad themes in distinguishing in Hungary and Russia in particular.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about Hungary is there's still an element of political competition in Hungary. And so, I was able to talk to an opposition figure who started a political party and is now in the European Parliament and preparing to help the opposition challenge Orban in an election next year. I talked to an anti-corruption activist who's very public and maps corruption in Hungary. I talked to an investigative journalist who has uncovered some of Orban's corruption. The reason I note that, those people wouldn't be able to exist in Putin's Russia today. They'd be in prison, they'd be exiled, or they'd be in great physical danger. So in some respects, Orban has characteristics of Putinism, including the corruption, including a kind of circle of oligarchs who he enriches and then they take care of him. But it's just not nearly as pervasive and advanced as in Russia itself. I think in Russia, my guides were Navalny, Zhana, who's out of the country, and then a writer who was just a great thought leader on Russia. But Navalny, I think really he's kind of the other end of the coin of Putin, and that's what was so interesting to me about this is that what he basically describes is, I in each of these countries I wanted kind of to find the origin story for why we got to where we are, right? And in Russia, the origin story was very much the kind of humiliation of the loss of the Cold War that then led into the 1990s, in which you had these massive sell-offs of the state, because the state owned everything and then they're selling it off. And it's totally corrupt. And it enrages an already enraged public, that has lost the coin. Navalny explains to me, look, I grew up thinking I lived in the greatest country on earth, just like you did in America. I thought we were going to win. And then suddenly I'm eating West German army rations. And suddenly I'm seeing, as I become of age, the whole state just being sold off and people becoming billionaires. And what Putin does that is so clever when he kind of rises to power is he simultaneously taps into the grievance about that humiliation and those sell-offs while getting his hands on the things that have been sold off. And so he's simultaneously participating in the corruption while tapping into the grievance that people feel about it. And then he basically has spent the last 20 years building like the most corrupt government imaginable. There's no, and we've confronted this in government when we're sanctioning Russia, there's kind of very little distinction between the wealth of a lot of billionaire private interest and Putin himself and the Russian state. And he's found all these kind of vulnerabilities in global capitalism to move this money around. And so the whole system runs on corruption. And as Navalny said to me, he got accused of being a single issue guy. And his point was, well, there's only one issue. The entire system is just a corrupt racket, basically, And to your last point, Navalny's the one who said to me, he's like, look, Putin, everybody knows he's corrupt. And what Navalny wanted to show is that's unusual. What Putin wants to show is, no, everybody's corrupt. And so to the '08 crisis point, Navalny is the one who told me, look, after the '08 crisis, Putin could say, see, look how corrupt these guys are. They crashed the whole global economy, and the guys who crashed the global economy got bailed out, and everybody else got screwed. And so if you're living in a system, global system that is corrupt, you might as well have a strong man who at least kind of gives voice to your grievances, at least makes you feel a part of kind of the team, if you will, that is pushing back on this. And that to me is an interesting dynamic.
Yeah. So just so we can read it into the record, the forces that are creating opportunities for these authoritarians to kind of lay claim to power. This is, in your telling, it's not just a story of Trump in 2016, and we'll get to Trump in 2016. Yeah. This is something that has much deeper and pervasive roots. So what do you see as the kind of contributing factors that are creating opportunities for these would-be and very much real authoritarians to lay claim to power?
So I focus on three. And again, I make very clear at the outset, like this is I'm looking through my window, right? And many of us are writing about this topic, you are. But there are three structural forces that I look at, because I look at it from the perspective of someone who worked in American foreign policy and politics. And so I kind of consider this period of the last 30 years, from the end of the Cold War to where we got to now. How do we go from that moment where it seemed like democracy and liberal and open societies were the norm to where they now feel so under assault? And the three I focus on quickly to shorthand it. First, the kind of failure of the unregulated nature of global capitalism, that all these countries I looked at for this book were on the other side of the Cold War. And as capitalism washes over these countries and these huge expanses of the globe, we've also deregulated a lot of aspects of American capitalism. And that both fosters tremendous inequality. And I should be clear, it creates a lot of wealth and lifts a lot of people out of poverty. So it's not all a negative story, but it creates tremendous amount of inequality. And it also creates an opening for a lot of corruption because the less regulation you have, like the easier it is to concoct the kinds of schemes that Putin has concocted. And then when the bottom falls out in '08, people are like, this whole system is rigged. And in a place like Hungary, that's a young democracy. They weren't ready for that shock. I mean, and they were open to much more traditional appeals. So one thing I look at is the kind of the failure of the particularly unbridled strain of capitalism. The second I look at is the national security, kind of the national securitization, if you will, of post 9/11 American national security policy. The war on terrorism, the Iraq War, the kind of extrajudicial aspects of it, some of which could be easily expropriated by autocrats. So both Putin and Xi Jinping and Orban, they've all used the language of the war on terror to justify their power grabs. It doesn't mean we're responsible for it, but it does mean as the world superpower, we're kind of shaping an environment that is very securitized and in which national security can be enlisted to make arguments for everything from invading Iraq, in our case, to canceling the direct election of governors in the case of Vladimir Putin after the Beslan attacks in 2002. And I also think that the national security mindset of the post 9/11 years kind of easily bred into a kind of us versus them politics, where at first the them were the terrorists, but in our country, that them became the Black president and the immigrants at the southern border and Antifa. I mean, we live this every day. And then the third thing is technology. And people often, sometimes people, as I've been doing this book, these book talks, say, well, isn't this always the case? There's always a competition between democracy and authoritarianism. What's really different now? Well, the third, technology and social media, and these tools that we're going to empower and connect people and did, then become the perfect tools of disinformation and surveillance.
Right.
And literally you have a circumstance where the kinds of conspiracy theories, let's just say in America, that might have just existed in very small communities, now like 40% of the country can believe those things. So to me, capitalism, technology, and national security, big issues, I know, but I was kind of looking at the ways in which those interacted with this authoritarian trend. And the pinnacle of this to me was I'm in Shanghai and I'm kind of looking at the Shanghai skyline and I'm disoriented because, you know, I'd just been woken up by Chinese officials and basically let me know they were reading my emails, warning me not to have Obama meet with the Dalai Lama. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking there's something familiar about the Shanghai skyline, but there's something that feels kind of foreign. And it was tied to the fact of this kind of feeling of surveillance around me. And I realized if you take 30 years of American capitalism, national security fixation technology, and you just drain all the democracy out of it,
this is what you get.
What you get, that the Chinese Communist Party is actually kind of the logical next actor, right? And that's something I think we need to think a lot about as Americans, because I think it's true, and it's not something I thought at the beginning of writing this book. It's something that I kind of unfortunately came to that conclusion. Yep.
So let's linger on this moment that you had when you were in Shanghai, because I think, you know, running through the book are a set of laments or misgivings or things, I mean, that you're struggling with. You're clearly struggling with and reflecting back on U.S. foreign policy making. And they proceed at sort of two registers, if I read them right. One is a lament about politics as usual, in a sense that there space to deal with certain kinds of issues. And well, no, in the regular course of things, frankly, there's not. And so the argument for you not to go speak to the Dalai Lama was not an argument that had content to it. It was an argument where it was made clear to you, there's no point, right? This is not going to go anywhere. This will not yield anything. And in that kind of world, politics as usual doesn't offer kind of space or traction to then make headway or to, you know, cut left. And now we're going to grapple with it in a serious-minded way. And that's a kind of lament, if I read the book as you had intended, that I was picking up. And another one was a lament about particular decisions, a decision to go into Iraq, a decision that's sort of discrete, or a set of commitments in the construction of new technologies and globalization that then would allow for the kind of surveillance that led the people to knock on your door and to let you know that they knew exactly what you were up to. Yeah. Does that sound? That's right. Sound about right?
That sounds right. And you know, one of the things that's tricky about this is, so I look at just take the China example, you know, because I'm in my hotel room in Shanghai. It's late 2017. The former president of the United States is down the hall. And I'm woken up in the middle of the night by two guys, including a pretty high-ranking Chinese official, who were warning me that Obama should meet the Dalai Lama, a meeting that we had not announced. So they're clearly like in my email, or the Dalai Lama's guy's email. And it's like, how do we get here? You know, and you see the Uyghur situation, and you see, and I spent a lot of time, with Hong Kong protesters and young people. And when I look back on this is, and this is a hard thing, people kind of want to simplify it, like, well, what's the one thing you should have done differently? What's the one mistake Obama made, and look, there are certain decisions, like the decision to invade Iraq, right, that are such a scale that you can point to that and say that was a huge problem, that was a huge mistake. And then there are decisions of Obama's that I think were wrong. But there's actually a bigger point here that I really reflected on in the China relationship, but I think it cuts across the board, which is in the last 30 years since Tiananmen, what have we prioritized in this relationship? Profit. If I were to name profit, national security, technology, and democracy and human rights, can any of us credibly say that we really cared about democracy and human rights with respect to China? No. We've cared about profit and open markets above all. And then to some extent, we've cared about national security and geopolitical cooperation. And we just really haven't, we've gone to the mat with the Chinese on purchases of soybeans from the Midwest more than we have on the Uyghurs, I reflect on the Obama years, like there's always a reason that's a good reason at the time, right? Like with the financial crisis, we needed to save the global economy by working with the Chinese to stimulate demand in the global economy. And that felt like a really important priority in the first term. In the second term, we went to Beijing at the height of the first big Hong Kong protest movement, the umbrella movement, in 2014, and we were focused on climate change. We were focused on a progressive priority, getting China to make an ambitious commitment to what became the Paris Agreement. Seemed like a good thing to do. But I think consistently, and then what I realized is I reflected on this first as a US official, but then just as an American, our businesses have made the same compromises. They look the other way. All that money, venture capital that's floated into China that funds their technology and their surveillance. I did tell the story of getting called by the Rockets GM because he tweeted about Hong Kong and the Chinese had pulled all the games down, and then suddenly people are apologizing. When's the last time you saw a Hollywood movie critical of the Chinese Communist Party? Right. Plenty of movies critical of the American government. As a society, we have to acknowledge we have deprioritized small d democracy in our relationship with China, but also at home. I mean, as we're now kind of catching up to now. And so to me, some of these are their decisions that you can point to that are tied to this. And I think a lot of the Bush decisions post 9/11 set us either wittingly or unwittingly on a fairly undemocratic path. I think Obama, you can say, I look back and I'm like, why were we not trying to do more to regulate these tech platforms when we could see the disinformation spreading? We were slow on some things like that. Or you could say, Obama should have done more after the financial crisis to deal with kind of structural inequalities. But I also think there's just kind of something about this era of American hegemony where we really didn't prioritize democracy, except, by the way, tragically, connecting it rhetorically to things like the war in Iraq, mm-hmm. which actually undermined democracy. Mm-hmm. And so why would we be surprised that 30 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, like democracy is less important to people around the world than making money? Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm not like a Marxist here. Like I'm not as part of the U.S. government, but there's something there we have to deal with.
Yep. So and the thing consists of, again, some discrete decisions, some about priorities, some having. I mean, it's a whole amalgamation of kind of trends that you're pointing to. I'm hoping you can say a bit about the role of the United States in the work of those people who want to push back against these trends that you're describing. When we think about the significance of the 2016 election, not just domestically and what it meant for our country, but what our country means as a democracy, as an imperfect democracy, as a democracy that is failing in a number of regards, what that means for the ability of those people who would like to, within their own countries, advance democracy, be it within Hungary or within Russia or in Hong Kong. How do you think about about sort of it's not just the status of the United States vis-a-vis the military might that it can wield. It's what it represents in the imaginations of those people who would like to fight on behalf of democracy.
I think that we have to recognize that overwhelmingly this kind of begins with who we are at home, and it's bigger than our government. And I remember I used to say to friends when I was in government, I was always struck, coming out of like New York and NYU, and I have friends to the left, and America's terrible for democracy. And I said, one of the things you're struck by in the U.S. government, right, is not only that the U.S. government is often the only lifeline to people who are struggling for democratic values, but more importantly than that, people around the world are smart and they can separate out the things that they admire about American democracy from the policies of the American government that they don't like, And in the 2016 election kind of punctured that, because it wasn't just the fact that Trump was president and it was doing a bunch of crazy stuff. It was the fact that like we had elected Trump, that our system had produced Trump. And Navalny said to me, for instance, a guy who says, I don't want anything from the United States. I want to do this on my own. I don't want you to cause problems. He said to me, his whole life, like he'd been making one argument essentially, which is that in a democracy, like a better person ends up on top and there's more accountability. And he's like, now Trump is there, there's someone corrupted at the top. And this is something that's very easy for someone to understand. He said the ordinary person just kind of reading a state newspaper on the sidewalk in Moscow can understand, well, like America, like that's not democracy. Look who's in charge over there. They're like a corrupt autocrat, And so there was this kind of mythic, this kind of unseen credibility that America had, that for all our problems and mistakes and foreign policy blunders and what have you, we at least were like the place that exemplified that democracy is a better bet than the other systems, and that it kind of works for enough people. It's not perfect, but it allows you to get better. It allows you to make changes. It allows for there to be accountability. It prevents the excesses of like a Putin. And so what I found chiefly that people need from America is just for America to once again set a democratic example that is recognizable and attractive and can be motivating to people who are struggling for democracy. I think that extends into our foreign policy. America to be a little bit less of a hypocrite, talking about democracy out of one end of our mouth while we're like buddies with Mohammed bin Salman, like people see that, like there's a cost to that, an intangible cost around the world. And then the last piece is more like, how do we better and more effectively support democracy itself in the world? So all these things are connected, but unless we're getting the example part right, it doesn't matter what you do in your foreign policy. If we don't look like we're setting a constructive democratic example, it's none of it is going to make a difference.
Yeah. I mean, there's the example, and then there's the narrative that's built around the example. And I think I was struck by reading your book, was the attention to issues involving identity and meaning making, and even like storytelling. Like, what is the story that's told about who you are and what you stand up against? I mean, you're interested in both the narratives then that the authoritarians, the autocrats tell, but then also the narratives that are available to democracy reformers. And initially, I mean, when I first started reading the book, I thought, well, this is Ben Rhodes is kind of the window that you're looking through. You were a former speechwriter, right? Yeah. And that this is how you approach the topic at hand. But increasingly, over the course of reading the book, I thought, no, that's not it. I mean, it may be that, but it's that, no, the narrative is the object of study itself. It's that your political science is one in which politics is about a contestation over narrative, the kinds of arguments you can put forward. And the reason why 9/11 is so significant, the reason why the markets falling apart in the aftermath of 2008 is so significant, the reason why the 2016 election is so significant is because it distorts the kinds of, and puts limits on the kinds of arguments that are available to some, just as it reaffirms the arguments of authoritarians who want to say, look, corruption is everywhere. Democracy isn't what it's cracked up to be.
That's right. And like the way I mean, to unpack a piece of this, if you think about the Cold War, there's so many things to say, but I'm going to focus on two things. The United States and the Soviet Union are in this contest of everything, of military might, political models, but also narrative, right? And by the time you get to the end of that, and America had done all kinds of things wrong in the course of the Cold War, of course, done a bunch of things right. But fundamentally, more people wanted to live like we did. And we just had a much better story than them, and like, that's an oversimplification again, but like that made a big difference. And today, I think,
harder to tell the story we would like to tell.
Well, it's also like some people in a lot of the developing world would rather live like China. They're like, wait a second, that looks like that's delivering. And one of the things that I found that was interesting is how much these authoritarians had invested in their narrative, right? And so in China, I really interrogated this question of like, well, how did they pick themselves up after Tiananmen when it looked like they were on the back foot, right? And what I heard is essentially they reconstructed the narrative. The narrative of the Chinese Communist Party from Mao Zedong to Tiananmen, was one of worldwide communist revolution and Marxist Leninism and that was not an available story after the Cold War because that had lost and they needed to open up to capitalism. And so as they're opening up to capitalism, they say, well, what's our legitimacy as a communist party that's plugging into a global capitalist system? And they decide to invest significantly in Chinese nationalism. And so everything from the media to the school curricula, certain subjects are banned, certain subjects are prioritized. Confucius is rehabilitated, who'd been trashed by the Chinese Communist Party. Suddenly he's a hero of the Chinese Communist Party because he stands for kind of the collectivism of the Chinese people. They spent time on narrative, right? Mm-hmm. And Xi Jinping has spent a lot of time on narrative. The Chinese dream he came to power talking about, and that's both the promise within China and the promise of national greatness. And we do not have, since the Cold War, we have not had a national narrative that was as unified and agreed upon at home and in the world as we had through the Cold War, when everybody kind of knew. And I kind of go back and reflect on growing up and getting the narrative through osmosis. We're the good guys, we're for freedom, we're for democracy. And again, people that was not always true, right? But that's what we believed, and that's what we told the world, that story. And the only real the real effort, the first real effort after the Cold War was to have a narrative of war against terrorism, and that's a very limited narrative. But Bush quite deliberately tried to make it as big a project as the Cold War, as fascism. Then Obama comes along, and his narrative is, we are the multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy. We are the demonstration that people who come from everywhere can be American. And that, while it sounds like an anodyne statement, was an incredibly triggering thing to some people, right? And Trump is the opposite narrative. He's like, no, we are Make America Great Again. We are basically a white Christian nation that is exceptional because of we assert it. And I think America, the degree of animosity and the contest in our politics is so acute right now, because on some level people can sense that what we're fighting about is not just who's going to run in the government, but we're fighting about like, who are we as a nation? And until we figure that out, that's why I subtitled it Being American and What We Made. Until we figure out who we are and what our national identity is, we're going to be quite limited in our capacity to positively impact the world.
Yes. So we said at the top here that Trump laid you on your back his election. But much of the book is not about, you say very little about Trump. Yeah. You don't sort of linger on him and all of his faults. And so this isn't to say that his election isn't significant. It obviously is significant in lots of ways. But does part of you think, having written the book, should you have been on your back in 2004? Should you have been in 2012? You're pointing to big structural factors that have been playing out over decades that have opened up space for these authoritarians to rise to power. And not just you, but all of us. Yeah. Should we have been more alarmed about the precarity of democracy than we were?
I mean, I'll just tell from personal experience. I mean, I think we should have after 9/11. There were the amount of change that took place in about 2 years, the momentum generated by everything from the Patriot Act to the invasion of Afghanistan to the invasion of Iraq. that the U.S. government did more in like those 2 years than, arguably to kind of change the nature of American government and our purpose in the world than any time in the kind of post-World War II period. But putting that aside, me personally, and again, this may sound partisan, but I want to preface it by saying, like, I'm seen now as a pretty partisan figure, I guess. I worked for Lee Hamilton, a moderate, pragmatic Midwesterner, when I moved to Washington. I was writing speeches for Barack Obama in 2008 about red states and blue states coming together. I didn't want it to be like this. In 2010, the Tea Party movement, there was something about it that from the very beginning, you had this instinct in the White House of, why are these people, the vitriol of that movement, take our country back, didn't feel like it was about deficits, and like some of this is racialized response to a Black president. Some of it is the depth of the grievances after the financial crisis, but then a lot of it is paid for. I mean, you had Koch brothers, and basically, if we talked about our country like we talk about other countries, we had oligarchs investing a lot of money to stir up a lot of right-wing populism at the same time that the Citizens United decision removes any constraints on money in politics, and that just explodes, including dark money in politics. Basically, almost at the same time that the Voting Rights Act is then gutted by the Supreme Court. That in the first term of the Obama administration, beyond any control we had, you have this kind of shift in terms of the degree, the ways in which the judiciary and money and kind of backlash anger is all being harnessed. And what was interesting to me as a lived experience in Washington, the people who got elected in 2010, those Republicans were not like the old Republicans. Like that was the beginning, the Mike Pompeo, Jim Jordan, Mark Meadows, a lot of these people who became the Trump guys, right? It's when they start to come to Washington, and there's no pretense of working with Obama. Like this is not, and I remember kind of feeling like I was going crazy through the Obama years, because then in the second term, it gets even weirder. We have birtherism, then we've got the Benghazi conspiracy theories, and I, as someone who was kind of a character in some of their conspiracy theories, I start to actually look in, what are they saying when they talk to each other? Like, what are they saying on Fox and talk radio, on Breitbart? And I'm like, this is crazy. Like, this is not normal. Like, this is like the Washington kind of political and media establishment is still kind of treating it like they're two parties that are competitive and they're negotiating. And I'm watching one of those parties, though, is not at all normal anymore. It's there's like a radicalization process taking place. And it took place throughout the Obama years, to the point that by the time Trump rides down the escalator, he is the Republican Party. Like he is the viewer they created through their media. He is the voter they created. He believes all the things that they've been telling them on talk radio or on Fox. Why wouldn't that be the next leader of the Republican Party? He was the front runner throughout that campaign. He had an easier time winning the Republican nomination in 2016 than Barack Obama had in 2008. And so to me, I think there's a post 9/11 moment you could look at. I mean, some people can take this all the way back to Gingrich or Reagan. I'm sure Republicans, there are things they don't like. Bill Clinton did bad things in the White House, or I don't know what they say about Obama. I guess he was a socialist, even though my critiques tend to be that he didn't do enough to change the structural nature of the economy. To me, the blinking warning signs throughout the Obama years, from the Tea Party on, though, are the ones that I just, to this day, I don't understand why people didn't take it more seriously. And there's people are still saying, wow, I can't believe the Republicans believed the big lie that the election was stolen. It's like, well, I wouldn't believe it. I'd be shocked if they stood up against it. I mean, I don't know why it's this incapacity of Americans to realize that, it's not that unusual to have a corrupt autocrat with the son-in-law down the hall and a mob that storms Congress. We just somehow think it can't happen here. And I would hope by now that we learned it can happen here, and it may very well happen again.
And so a big chunk of, one of the purposes, as I read into the book that you've written, is to point out that that which has happened here, which may feel sort of strange and unsettling, actually is foundational and rooted in big structures and is playing out in lots of places around the globe. Right.
That's 100% the case. And in some cases, there's like, coordination. I mean, there's not, I'm reading today about this Pegasus, this surveillance apparatus targeting journalists and dissidents and activists and former officials. And I've been targeted by something like this. There's actually like pretty active cooperation among autocracies. There's a lot of structural things to be concerned about. I try in the book to illuminate, though, that there's also a lot of mobilization happening against autocracy. And we have to learn from each other and coordinate with each other as effectively as the autocrats to have a chance to come out on the other end of it.
Yeah, and the we are people who are champions of democracy. Right?
Small d, and people, by the way, who could totally disagree with me about the size of government or the Iran nuclear agreement or whatever. But like, if you look at what was successful in the American election in 2020 and what oppositions are trying to do in other countries, what just happened in Israel is when enough people are aware that, wait a second, this is existential. And basically everybody who's not on board with the autocratic program just needs to put aside their differences and fight this out. I think that's kind of the only, that's the way through this.
Yeah. So I want to get some questions from the audience, but one last one I can't resist, which is that how then do you think about the status of small d democratic work in the contemporary kind of political landscape, that where it should fit in the list of priorities of a Biden administration and how they're doing?
I mean, I think it needs to be the top priority, because I'm living proof that you can make a lot of positive policy changes, but like, and I think they're positive, people could disagree, but like your agenda won't survive if the illiberal autocrats come in and just start smashing it, like we can negotiate a Paris agreement and try to set the country on a path to clean energy, and then someone comes in who's an autocrat and tears it up, right? So democracy is the existential question. I think that the positive thing is the conversation is so much more advanced now than it was 10 years ago. We're having this conversation. People around the world are having these conversations in a way that they weren't in 2010 and probably should have been. And that allows us to identify, here's what they are doing on voting. Here's what they're doing on the judiciary. Here's what they're doing with the media. Here are the problems with social media. And part of the reason why you see, I think, in this country, right-wing efforts accelerating is because they know everybody's on to them, and so they're just trying to get as much of this stuff done before laws can be passed or enough elections can be won. And I do think for the Biden team, I'd like to see a lot more focus on this. And I know from being in the White House that it's hard to focus on things that you can't fix, because you're always coming up short. But if you can't pass a voting rights bill because of Joe Manchin, just keep trying to pass it every way you possibly can. Try to do whatever you can at the state and local level to push back, try to register people to vote. There's not just a one solution thing to this. You have to kind of be deploying everything you got in this.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, let's get some questions in from that have come in over the transom here. So you pointed out earlier that these autocrats are in contact with and coordinating with one another. We too are having to interact with, we meaning democratic forms of government, not just the United States, are having to interact with and work alongside autocratic countries. A place in which, one domain in which that's true has to do with issues involving energy. And so we have a question that says, curious if issues of energy democracy came up in the various places that you were investigating. I ask this knowing you understand how fragile the US electricity and energy markets are. How are we to think about energy markets and how that grafts onto issues involving democracy in the kind of in the story that you're telling?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the quick version I'd give that is it absolutely comes up. And I think Putin basically built his whole empire on control of Russian oil and gas, there's a fairly common nexus, obviously, between natural resource economies and autocracy, because the Saudi royal family is sitting on trillions of dollars, and that gives you a lot of leverage. I think the United States needs to just change these relationships fundamentally, with Saudi Arabia, to some extent with the UAE. And we see today, the indictment of Thomas Barak, but like I felt this influence when I was in DC. The Saudis, Emiratis spend a lot of money in American politics, and their agendas are fundamentally autocratic. And sometimes people say to me, well, if we kind of fundamentally alter our relationship with Saudi Arabia, won't they cause trouble on the energy markets? I mean, maybe, but what are they going to stop selling oil? I mean, they sometimes I think we Americans kind of self-censor a lot in our, like, we're not allowed to say anything about the Saudis. They say plenty of stuff about us. There's a kind of strange, we've shackled ourselves in part because we were the superpower. And so we're like, well, we can't comment that much on the internal affairs of these countries because for this or that reason. I mean, Putin isn't shy about commenting on things. So I think we can just, these countries have their own interest for why they want to sell oil, right? They don't want to burn themselves down, right? Literally. And to some extent, what they've been doing is spending a lot of money here to prevent us from moving to different forms of energy. So I think we have to break this psychic barrier. And this is one of this, or several of them. And this is one of them where it's like, well, we can't possibly rethink this relationship with, say, Saudi Arabia. Well, look at what it's cost us to not rethink that, and at a certain point, you would be willing to assume some risk of the unknown of moving in different directions in some of these relationships, as against the risk of the direction things have been going already, which is, the Saudi government getting more and more radical in terms of its dictatorship under Mohammed bin Salman.
Mm-hmm. Another question. Ben, do you have a sense of who might be writing the kind of persuasive narratives right now about the US role in the world, and how broad is their appeal? My sense is that new narratives for the United States cannot be forced, but need to resonate with the lived experience of Americans and those around the world.
That's an interesting question. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about the Biden team is, because I'm quite good friends with, people like Jake Sullivan, who's a national security advisor, and the narrative that they've kind of built is actually one for home, right? Which is that, like, we need America and the world needs to deliver for the middle class, and then the message to the world, which is an interesting message that Biden is telling, is that we have to show that democracies can deliver. That basically, we can build infrastructure, we can transition our economy, we can spend trillions of dollars. I think that is an important narrative. I think that's not the whole story, though, right? That's the story of just, we need to show we're not dysfunctional, we can do big things, that there's something attractive about America again and its democracy delivering. In terms of America and the world, I mean, I think that culturally speaking, what's interesting about America is something like the Black Lives Matter movement that has run into kind of, obviously headwinds in the United States in some ways. Like, the cultural ripple from that was quite profound around the world, because it was like America, once again, the underdog aspect of America, the social justice movements emanating from America, and the solidarity that people could find in that, everywhere from like Hong Kong to Black people protesting in places like France and the UK, but to like climate strikes. Like, there's America as the American narrative of activism and mobilization is very attractive and powerful around the world. The American civil rights movement is widely understood and followed around the world. And so, to me, what's interesting is you have this activist narrative that I think is connecting to a lot of the mass mobilization globally. And then you have a government narrative that is more about kind of what the government is doing, and they have to connect in some fashion, Yes. And by the way, the last thing I'd say about this, because I want to get to the questions, is what part of what's missing is the cultural narrative. And I mentioned before the reticence of Hollywood to take on China. They don't really take on small d democratic themes anymore. There's a lot of self-censorship in American expression these days. And I think I'd like to see that change because as silly as some of those Cold War movies and pop culture was, it was usually like had like a democratic message that if you talk to people who were in Eastern Europe, that stuff resonated.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, but can we add on a few more? You've got BLM as a constructive, potentially powerful force, not just in attending to the racial injustices and offering some kind of redress domestically, but in buoying the spirits of and focusing the attention of democratic reformers around the globe. Can we add on to that? That Trump isn't reelected and
yes.
And that repudiation that we have as a vice president, the first woman of color, right, in the White House. We have, through COVID, there's an opportunity, at least through sort of COVID diplomacy, to extend a different kind of, or present a different kind of face of US foreign policy that is not about terrorists, but about a recognition of the common good, these kinds of things.
Here's the narrative I would offer, and I kind of end my book on it, and I find it weirdly hopeful, right? Which is that part of what we've learned is that the same stuff that happens everywhere can happen in America, right? So I've said before, the corrupt autocrat, the son-in-law down the hall, the mob that storms the parliament, the corruption, all this stuff. There's opportunity in that. And the opportunity is this: if we can fight through that, if we can overcome that and kind of come out of this process and fight our way to preserving multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy, that is a much more powerful and relevant example to democratic movements around the world than America, the hegemon, sitting on a mountaintop and issuing edicts about democracy. People are watching us do this, and people didn't think Trump could get voted out. Because in some of their countries, it's impossible to vote the autocrat out. And so I think that was very powerful, to show people, hey, one of the things you can do in a democracy is you can get rid of the autocrat, and don't think that the people in Belarus didn't see that and plenty of other places. So yes, I think that one of the huge opportunities is we as citizens can demonstrate, hey, it's possible to get through this. Now, obviously it's much easier for us than it is for people in Belarus or Hong Kong, but it still matters, I think, to set an example of just, here's a bunch of people who look different and believe in different things and they're different colors, who are fighting the same brand of autocracy that we are. And yeah, let's roll up our sleeves and get this done.
Yeah. One last question, because we're approaching the end of our hour together. We are facing urgent and truly global challenges like the pandemic and climate change. Is there reason to be optimistic about the American leadership amidst these crises and the fate of America's image and influence abroad resulting from our global response to them, right? Big challenges, hard things. And while maybe we were doing something on the pandemic, offering meaningful leadership on climate change, where do you see that domestically? And if we fail on that front, what does that mean for our ability to assume a position of moral stature abroad?
I mean, I think we have to realize, if we fail on that, on the climate, people are going to look back on 50 years from now at this kind of whole period of American leadership and think that was the legacy. We were basically the ones who destroyed the planet, because we built this global model of consumption, and so the stakes are very high for us to get our act together. Now, I do think that, and we started to sense this in the Obama, when we started to really move as much as we could on climate without Congress and with the hostile Supreme Court, just to, we basically did everything we could regulatory wise, spend as much money as we possibly could. Just doing that, other countries are okay, let's go, and I do think that if America, and hopefully Biden can do it in this next, bill, I know it's still not sufficient, but if America starts moving with real force against climate, I think that could become, the hopeful thing is that could become the big unifying project globally. What a healthier thing to fight than terrorism.
Yeah.
Like if the big multilateral project of American leadership for the next 30 years is redesigning the global economy to save the planet, like sign me up for that. Now, the world sees a whole political party here that doesn't even believe that that's true. And that's a huge problem, right? And we're either going to figure that out or we're not. Because if we don't figure that out, not only is democracy in trouble, but the planet is too. I do think there's a connection between these things, because I think that that the kind of nationalists, particularly ones I'm looking at, like a Orban, a Putin, a Modi, a Bolsonaro, these are not the people that are going to save the planet, because they're not, those kinds of people don't think about 30 years from now. They don't think about global collective action. So if you care about the climate and you think, well, maybe I shouldn't care about democracy because maybe autocracies can move faster to deal with climate change, I'm not sure that's the right bet, because I think a collection of nationalist autocrats are not the people who are going to solve the climate crisis. Unfortunately, we were going to need some of their cooperation, including the Chinese Communist Party. But I think democracy ultimately is going to be more responsive, because the pressure is going to come up. If you look at who is most active on climate in the world today, it's Europe. And that's a democratic, small d democratic outcome. It's because their populations have raised that issue. So I'm hopeful that democracy and climate action can and are convergent.
And it's been a real pleasure talking to you. Your book was a terrific read, and it's I commend it. After the Fall, congratulations on it, and thanks for spending an hour with us.
Thanks. I love this. It was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. I look forward to hopefully getting to Chicago soon.
We'll get you to